Welcome to the India Fintech Diaries, the only podcast focused exclusively on the Indian fintech market. I'm Elroy.
And I'm Hemant. In each episode, we dive into the latest trends, ideas, innovations, business models, and personalities that are shaping India's fintech landscape.
We also invite amazing guests who are innovators and industry players that are driving the change that is helping make financial services more modern, innovative, and inclusive in India. Come join us as we explore the changing landscape of fintech in India. Welcome to India Fintech Diaries, the show for all things Indian fintech. I'm your host, Elroy.
And I'm your host, Hemant. Open Finance is transforming the way financial services are delivered across the globe. To discuss the impact of open finance, particularly in the context of India financial ecosystem, we have with us today Kiran Gopinath, founder of Open Finance Connect. Welcome to India Fintech Diaries, Kiran.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Kiran, so to begin with the episode, let's start with a brief introduction of yourself and what Open Finance Connect does.
First of all, thank you guys for inviting me here. As a background, I've been an entrepreneur for over 20 years. I've spent much of my life in digital advertising, and which is slightly far away. It sounds a little distant from open finance, but one of the issues that started cropping up in digital advertising was the issue of privacy. So the first thing I actually got into in about 2019 was into data privacy and trying to figure out how we could protect the consumer from their data being shared without their consent. And I was looking at various models, and at that time, uh, one of my friends who currently runs SamvAAd, Mahesh, suggested that I join iSpirit and see if we can build a framework for digital advertising based on DAPA, which is the model where you empower consumers to control their the use of the data. So that's how I got into this space. And then iSpirit was looking at the account aggregator framework, and people are building on it. And that's how I got hooked into open finance. Cut to 2023, I actually got in touch with the folks at SamvAAd, and BGMI suggested that we could sort of look at few things that we could try and grow at SamvAAd, and that was the first starting point. And since then, we've been uh, brainstorming ideas and talking about open finance. After which, I sort of realized that there is a potential to try and explain what open finance is to the world, and what drives open finance, what is driving the adoption of open finance globally. And there is a need to understand why this will work for many of the countries in the world. And that's where the whole idea of the Global Open Finance Adoption Report started growing in about the April-May timeframe of this year. And since then, we've been working together, Samati and I, on building this report and understanding as to how open finance is going to take off. Now, that brought me to a point where I thought of how this information, how this knowledge needs to be used by people across the world, and how do we sort of get people on a platform to talk about the various issues when it comes to thinking about open finance, thinking about implementing open finance, and operationalizing it. So there are different countries in different states. Points. So India is obviously the world leader, followed by Brazil and the US. And then you have countries that are thinking about it, like countries in the Middle East, countries in Africa, and so on. So the point was, how will these countries that are thinking about evolving or considering open finance learn from the people who have already implemented it and gone through the process? So that was the starting point for Open Finance Connect. So it is a platform to bring people together on the platform to discuss open finance, while there is a research angle where we will be producing research reports which will help these discussions.
Understood, Kiran, and very, very interesting transition from the world of advertising to the world of fintech. so to say. Before we dive deeper into the topic, Kiran, let's focus on the word itself, open finance, because over the years it has become a bit ambiguous of a term. So, if you have to really define open finance, of what are the defining characteristics of open finance, how did it come about as from a genesis point of view, and what is the difference between open finance and open data?
So the first starting point was open banking. So let's go back
Right.
to 2016. So the this open banking really started off in the UK around that time frame. This was largely because of the terrible customer service and customer experience with the banks. So, the folks at UK looked at regulation from the EU, which is called PSD2, and decided to use that, which empowers consumers and customers to be in charge of their own data. And that was the starting point. So then it started out with payments, where people could make payments to fintechs, using fintechs and so on, to other people, other entities, and so on. So it initially started with A2A, which is account to account
Right.
transfers. And then the whole idea was, how do we take this to payments beyond just account to account transfers? And that was the starting point for open finance. So open finance went beyond just transferring money between account to account, between enabling people to move their account from bank to bank. And this was enabled because open finance started enabling people to share the financial data with entities who are not just banks themselves. So that you could share your data with fintechs who could use this data to give you more better products, better customer service, and so on and so forth. So that is really the genesis of open finance. And the India has a fantastic focused approach to open finance. So if you look at the actual definition of open finance, it stands for the empowerment of consumers to be in control of the financial data and be able to share that with any other entities for better customer experiences and for better access to services and products. So that is, in a nutshell, today's definition of open finance. Now, from open finance, where will this go? So this will naturally go into open data, where you have not just financial data that we are looking at, but data from
Right.
various other sources, which will then go into helping consumers to get better products, better services elsewhere. So if you look at open finance, the way I look at this progression is that you have financial data being shared with financial institutions, regulated entities today. But as it expands, it could go to industries like, for example, travel, right? It could
Yeah.
go to entertainment. It could go to anything. And it'll enable these entities to give far more better consumer and customer experiences, and even help create newer products that we are not even able to think of today. And that will be the starting point for the transition from open finance to open data. As the data sources open up, I think it's going to be a fascinating time in a few years.
Kiran, also this year's SamvAAd 2024, your report titled Global Open Finance Adoption Report GoFar 2024-2030 was released, and you alluded a bit of this in your introduction as well. And this was an in-depth analysis of this topic across 48 countries. So can you talk to us a little bit of some of the salient highlights of this report?
Our learning has been phenomenally exciting in this. We're very excited as to what we saw.
Right?
There are clear outliers in the space. There are different reasons as to why adoption in certain countries will happen in a certain way, and why there could be a slower adoption in some countries, and so on and so forth. So the key reasons we see adoption in the Western world is for better customer experience.
Okay.
So whether we look at the UK, for example, where it started out with wanting to provide better customer experience, to the US. Now, the US has a very different structure, but most of the use cases are for better experiences, better financial management, and so on. Now, the fascinating part of this report, what we learned was India's first, if you look at the creme de la creme of India's society, or the top end of the socioeconomic spectrum,
Right.
It sort of reflects the Western world in a lot of ways. So
Correct.
if you look at today's numbers, we're talking about the first 90 million, the top 100 million. The use cases are sort of similar to that, what's happening in the Western world. So if you look at the numbers that are growing, the lending numbers are insane, right? So we're doing about $1 billion a month, which is flowing through the account aggregator ecosystem,
Correct.
right? So who are these people, and why are they really moving to the account aggregator system? It is because of better customer experiences today, right? So everybody's moved from having to take papers and running to the branch offices, and they're finding it easier to jump onto the digital platform and move the data digitally. So that's
Correct.
really improving, moving the needle on customer experience here. So that's the first part. And this is true about Brazil as well. So if you look at the three countries that we talk about in the report as being the number one, number two, number three in the next few years, it's India, US, and Brazil. So Brazil has a similar experience. The top 15% of the population has adopted it for very similar reasons. And then, of course, the next part of it is, how will 85%, what's going to be the approach to reach 85% in Brazil? In India, what's going to be the approach to reach the next, billion people in the country, and so on and so forth, is going to be about financial inclusion. But when you look at the initial starting point,
Yeah.
it is going to be about better customer experience for most countries. And the other part was India, is an outlier for us in many ways. When you compare the GDP, when you
Correct.
compare various parameters in India, like the GDP, the lifestyle, and so on, it's far lower than many of the other countries that we were looking at. And yet, open finance seems to be taking off really well here. And therefore, how will the next 100 million, how the next 200 million people come on board, is the interesting fact that we sort of came across in the report. We expect that India plays a significantly is a significant leader
Correct.
and will play a big role because of the fact that it plays in both of these areas. In some part, it reflects the Western world. In some parts, when you talk about financial inclusion, there could be lessons for sub-Saharan Africa to look at India as well.
And Kiran, you touched upon that other than India, US and Brazil are the other countries that are expected to lead this open finance adoption. And you touched about some parts of it. Can we dive a bit deeper and look at how open finance works in those markets? What is the regulatory basis for adoption, and how does it compare with the India market?
So the US is very different. So let's start with the US first.
Correct.
So US started looking at open banking, open finance way back in the day. We look at about, I think, about 2015 timeframe. This was because there is a company called Plaid, which
Correct.
is a data aggregator there, and they started building this capabilities of data aggregation through screen scraping, right?
Okay.
So that was a starting point for what you could now call as open finance in many ways. So they would help you get a unified view of your bank accounts, look at your balances and so on and so forth. And that started out in the US way back in the day. Now, in open finance, when we look at open finance, and typically people assume that when you talk about open finance, you're talking about regulated open finance. Now, in a regulated open finance, you have a framework, you have a standardized framework, you have APIs which have certain standards that are followed, and you have rules and regulations that everybody plays by, and so on.
Correct.
So, this situation is yet to evolve in the US, right? But in the rest of the world, people have looked at it slightly differently. Now, in the US, the use cases have been about personal finance management, wealth management, and so on and so forth, less about lending compared to the rest of the world. Because, firstly, I think there's a lot of credit available in the US already. So, there is lesser friction there for customers to look for something even better at this point.
Okay.
But it is something that will evolve in the US. So, I mean, just to sort of digress for a second, I was doing some research in my own city of San Jose in California a few years back, and we found that there is a significant population of Latinos who are unbanked and underbanked, and
Yeah.
therefore these were people who had income of about $20,000, $30,000 a year. And the whole point was, why are they unbanked and why are they underbanked? And therefore, these people did not have any access to formal, financial products, or they were not in the system, so to say, right? So, would a regulated framework make sense for them? Was a question that arose, and yes, it would, because you're bringing in systems where you can think about financial inclusivity for these people in some of these areas. But having said that, the US is facing certain challenges in setting up a regulated framework at this point.
Correct.
So there is a body called as the Consumer Financial Protection Board, the CFPB, which has finalized rules for a very similar kind of a framework, very similar to the UK. It's using what is called as FAPI as the financial grade API framework.
Right.
But the problem is the banks are not very happy with it for many reasons. They don't want it to be regulated. They say that we were already doing fine. We were moving away from screen scraping to using APIs already to make it more safer and so on. So there is no need for a regulated body to come in and tell us what to do. The second part of it is around pricing.
Right.
And I think the whole point was CFPB says, and this is the problem that exists in open finance globally, where people, where the organizations who manage open finance frameworks and the entities that are in charge of managing the regulatory bodies, if I might call them that, are of the opinion that the customer owns their data,
Correct.
the customer owns the data, and therefore there cannot be any price for the movement of this data. Whereas the banks and financial institutions are of the opinion that you have to pay for the infrastructure that we're building and so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons that in the US, that's the second reason I would think that there is some kind of a friction there. So with the new Republican government in place, with the new entity called as DOG, which
Yeah.
which is run by Elon Musk, going after these kind of regulatory bodies like CFPB, will they exist is a big question now.
Yes.
But having said that, I would think that open finance will exist with or without a regulated body in the US, and therefore we think that the numbers will continue to grow and will be a significant second behind India in the overall numbers. Now, Brazil is different. Brazil has the central bank regulating it and managing it, and they're doing a number of things to improve open finance. They're making it. They're trying to get an insurance and so on and so forth to participate in the open finance ecosystem and so on and so forth. So it's structurally, I think there are different approaches between India, US, and Brazil. So it's an interesting set of countries to watch how it evolves.
Kiran, you made some interesting points about the roles that standards actually play in the allowing ecosystem partners to connect, share information, and actually spearhead the adoption of open finance. Like, for example, in some markets like the EU, the regulator has been very prescriptive about what standards need to be adopted. While, like you pointed out, in the markets like the US, initially industry bodies evolved their own standards for adoption by the ecosystem members, and then the regulators actually got involved. So, what do you think are some of the pros and cons of both methods of actually enforcing standards on open finance? And of course, India is a very different case altogether with account aggregator and SamvAAd. It'd be good if you could touch a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think if you speak to a number of people who are working in the space, whether they're NGOs and so on, they're of the opinion that regulation is a great starting point. So
Right?
if you have a mandate to set up things, it helps in open finance getting started off the block. And I think it is true for most countries. I mean, if you keep the US out, and US is always an outlier in many ways, there is a need for regulation to come in. Even in India, it was RBI which really started it off.
Right. With the whole
Uh,
A mandate and the A license.
exactly. So, and if you look at Brazil, for example, it's the same thing with in most of the other countries. So I think it makes sense to have it start off as a with a strong mandate coming in, strong regulations coming in. While you start with a strong mandate, you have to make it lighter and probably let other entities get access to it with guardrails in place and so on. So with purpose limitation, with time limitation, and all of that in place. So I think that would be a great way to get open finance off the ground in many countries.
Kiran, in terms of adoption benchmarks, how does India actually compare with regions like the EU, which were actually early adopters of open finance?
So I always call EU as a university. So it's a great place for them to come up with laws and regulations. But when it
Right.
comes to actual practical implementation, I think India really takes the lead here. So I think India looked at all of this stuff. So EU is way behind in open finance. So I think India has done a phenomenal job of executing and delivering on open
Right.
finance. I think in terms of operationalizing, India is way ahead. In terms of the number of people, I was telling you at the start, open finance is a huge subject. But when you look at it, India is so good at doing a number of things way ahead of time that even the US, while they talk about all, I'll give you an example. Let's talk about the economic model,
Yeah.
the pricing as an issue. So US banks proposed something. So they said we need to have pricing for data access, right? India is already thinking about pricing, right? India is already thinking about an economic model. So I would think that India is going to lead in the front already.
Yeah.
So people would have an economic model. So if you were to look at country, follow a country like some countries in the Middle East or in Africa, it's very easy for them to just look at the India playbook and say, hey, look, this is what India has done. This is the way you should set up pricing. Start with static pricing, get into dynamic pricing later uh, down the road. Don't build it at start. These are this is going to be such a easy thing for the rest of the world to follow by just watching India. India is already leading in the customer experience place, in the customer experience space, but India will also lead in financial inclusion because of the kind of moves they're making to ensure that everybody down the socioeconomic spectrum starts benefiting from this as well. So, in many ways, I think that the world will be watching India and talk about.
Kiran, I think another important question that often comes up as far as open finance is how do you actually take open finance from zero to one, which is more important in India's case when you're really looking at population scale rollouts. So, what are some of the common challenges you have seen in your study that you've done across countries? And in particular, what challenges are you seeing today in India that could hamper the growth of open finance?
So, the first question is getting banks to share data.
Yeah.
Right, that has been the biggest problem, and it's been a problem in the UK since 2016. It is a problem everywhere else, but India, fortunately, sort of convinced the banks. Let's use that word, and got the banks to agree to join in the data sharing framework. That is the biggest challenge everywhere. Which is where a regulated, mandated approach definitely makes a lot of sense. When That's the first part. The second part, when you look at adoption, right? So
Yeah.
let's look at some of the key adoption drivers for open finance. Like we said, if you were to start looking at customer experience, improving customer experience, you then have to look at the right demographic for it. You have to figure out whether the country has smartphone penetration. You have to look at whether the country has a strong technological infrastructure, whether there is digitization of the banks. Are
Right.
banks digital? Can they really transfer data in a digital form? And then it is about the customer savviness, right? So smartphone penetration is one, but have these people transacted financially on the phones? Are there mobile money accounts? People being able to use mobile phones to transfer money or to have any financial transactions,
Right.
making payments, and so on. So if they do that, I think that sets the ground for open finance, what we call as the readiness for open finance to be implemented in those countries. So now coming to the second part of your question, what will hamper India's growth? So the way we see it is that growth, it's been phenomenal so far. So if you just looked at March 23 to March 24,
Yeah.
India grew at a phenomenal 1059%, right? So this growth is going to happen till about, the way we look at it is till about 25.
Okay.
It will obviously grow at some phenomenal rate. We'll probably hit about 250 odd million people. But after that, the growth rate will slow down as we start getting into, firstly, because of this sheer scale, but also because of the kind of use cases that need to start evolving for those segments. So, for example, today we are talking about personal loans of a certain size. People have bank accounts. You can just look at how much data, how much money they have in their bank accounts. Can they pay it back? Will they pay it back? All of that. It's easy. But when you start going down after you gotten your first 250 million to 300 million people, the next part, the next segment, you have that much of data to make those decisions, is going to be key. And therefore, what is the use case, right? So obviously,
Right.
lending would be the number one driver for those segments from there on. And therefore, how will it work when you're looking at the risk that is involved, and how will lenders look at it, and what will be a workable model for that? Those are key issues that need to be resolved in some way. Will the government step in? I don't know. Should the government step in? Another question.
Right.
Or can the market manage it, and not have crazy interest rates that will reduce the trust in some of the in those segments there. So the one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier was, one of the key drivers is trust, right?
Right.
So will people trust the entire using mobile phones for transactions? I think that is one of the key drivers that is most important in open finance, and that becomes trust becomes more and more important as you go down the socioeconomic spectrum. And I would think that those will be the key issues that Sahamati and the government will have to solve to ensure there is trust built, and the processes need to be much more simpler, even more simpler than where it is today, to get loans, small ticket loans, and so on and so forth. So I would think that those will be the issues that need to be resolved.
Kiran, looking into the year 2030, and it's a good thing you brought up use cases, right? So, looking ahead into the year 2030, what new products, services, or use cases you think are going to be powered by open finance?
Oh, I think it's going to be phenomenal. I think travel is one of the use cases that comes to mind straight away. So when you look at, whether it is about using your financial data to understand, how people are traveling,
Right.
and for people to be able to hyper personalize their products
Right.
to customers, is going to be phenomenally useful. The next thing that's happening in open finance is interoperability
Right.
of open finance ecosystems across the globe. So, what happens in the US is that, let's say there is a student, there are people coming in from India here, either to work or to study. You have to start building your credit from day one
Correct. Correct.
again, right?
Credit history
Now, if you,
portability will be very important.
absolutely. So you move that here. I think that that would help people straight away be able to buy a car, buy a home, whatever else, right? So, and this is very useful not just for individuals but also for businesses.
Right.
So you can start off with, say, look, I have this history in India, and this is my bank balance, whatever else, and get credit from any country in the world. So open finance is going to transform very significantly the way individuals travel across the globe, within domestically and internationally, and for companies to be able to manage their finances, and to be able to successful globally as well. And I think this is a great point for Indian companies, especially given that open finance is evolving so quickly in India. And this will also be very useful for large companies, or mid to large companies as well, as they start, as interoperability starts coming into play in the next few years. And I think 30 and beyond,
Yeah.
it's going to be a phenomenal time for all of these.
Kiran, thanks a ton for joining us today and sharing your views on open finance. If our listeners wanted to know more about open finance and connect with you or download the report, what's the best way to do that?
So the best place to do it is sign up on openfinanceconnect.com. The report will be available for download in a couple of weeks. It's undergoing design right now, and we will email those reports to you as soon as possible, and that will be a great starting point.
Excellent. I'll include all those details in our show notes. And thanks once again for speaking with us, Kiran.
Thank you for having me.
That's it from India Fintech Diaries this week. Do log on to our website, indiafintechdiaries.com, for show notes and other exclusive content. Until next time, stay safe.